Good morning, everybody. I'm going to call today's Thursday, February 20th, 2025 committee hearing for Minnesota House of Representatives State Government Finance Policy Committee to order. First things first, we are going to move the minutes from February 18th. Representative Sexton, would you like to move the minutes? Okay, Representative Sexton moves approval of the minutes of February 18th. Any questions, comments, corrections? Hearing none, all in favor? Aye. Opposed? Minutes are approved. This morning we have with us the Office of the Legislative Auditor, who will be doing a walkthrough of their most recent report on the Office of the State Auditor. And yes, we have two auditors, and they do different things. So we have with us three members, actually four from the OLA. There she is. And they will be walking through the findings. Members will then have a chance to talk about the findings. I would imagine Representative Bonner and I will have comments more than anybody else. But this is what we do here in this committee. We have jurisdiction over both of these organizations, and we want to make sure that we make the most out of it. So we will be moving in. So if you would please, to our three testifiers, introduce yourself for the record and proceed with the walkthrough.
Thank you, Mr. Chair and members. For the record, my name is Lori Lyson. I'm the Deputy Legislative Auditor for the Financial Audit Division at the Office of the Legislative Auditor. So this morning, we're going to do an overview of our performance audit of the Office of the State Auditor, which we released back in January. We perform audits of each of the constitutional offices once every 4 years. So the last time the state auditor was audited by our office was back in 2021. This particular audit combines both financial activities and IT security controls. One reason that we included the IT portion of this audit is because the state auditor's office is outside the centralized minute services. So what that means is they have to develop their own security programs, their own policies and procedures, and standards. So for the result of our audit, for the financial activity, we're going to really see that the office generally had really strong internal controls and followed legal criteria. However, for the IT portion of the audit that we performed, you're going to see that there are a significant number of improvements that we're identifying. So before I turn it over to the audit directors themselves, I just want to notify you all that there are some redactions within the report. So that is done for security purposes. And what that means is we can talk in general about that area, but we may not answer specific questions. So with that, I'll turn it over to Mr. Weiserman.
And Ms. Lyson, I'll jump in on that. And so several of my members, and I would imagine some of yours, said, why are they redacting? And Representative Bonner and I serve on a commission where we redact everything because it actually provides a roadmap for bad actors out in the real world. And in the industry part of the industry that I work in, we don't ever publish things that effectively give a roadmap to a vector of compromise. The cybersecurity world is one of don't allow your enemy to see your weaknesses. So that's very, very important. And while it does drive certain people that may roam the halls here crazy that we don't fling open everything that we do here for full disclosure, keeping things off the radar of bad actors is exceptionally important. So while that is redacted, you've got two IT professionals in here that will tell you that in and of itself is a best practice to not let that sort of stuff out into the wild. So with that, please proceed.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Good morning. My name is Zach Weiserman. I was one of the audit directors on the audit along with Mark Matheson. Other members that are not here that helped with the audit included Peng Zhang, Deb Frost, Ria Bowick, Nikolai Brockmeyer, Nicole Hegem, and Ben Path. And as Lori noted, this was released on January 29th, 2025. And as she also noted, this is one of the 4 Minnesota constitutional offices. Some of the functions the office performs includes conducting audits and assisting with tax increment financing, among other items. During the audit, we performed work to determine if the office had adequate internal controls, including IT-related, and to determine if the office complied with significant finance and IT-related legal requirements. The time period for the audit was July 1st, 2021 through December 31st of 2023, a 2.5-year period. Areas we examined included payroll expenditures, non-payroll expenditures, receipts, which were primarily fees, billing, and deposits, and information technology security controls. As seen on page 8 of the report, the state auditor received funding from several sources during our audit time period. The majority were received from appropriations coming from the general fund and a small portion from the miscellaneous special revenue fund. There's also a small portion of other receipts noted on the slide that were primarily from accounting software and seminar fees. In addition, expenditures, which were also noted on page 8 of the report, totaled about $21 million for employee payroll, and then about $3.3 million in non-payroll expenditures, which was primarily rent, equipment, employee expense reimbursements, contracts, and some other goods and services. In our audit for financial-related activity, we found that the office generally complied with significant finance-related requirements and generally had adequate internal controls. However, we did identify some instances of noncompliance and internal control weakness related to asset management. That came in the form of 2 findings for that financial activity. And those 2 asset management findings are presented on the slide here, which we'll dive into in detail on the next couple slides. And then following that, Mark will take over and perform or present some of the IT findings. In the first asset management finding related to asset acquisitions, we identified 6 acquisitions that did not have an asset number assigned when the office acquired them. Subsequently, the items were also not recorded in the state auditor's capital asset system. This was out of a total of 70 asset acquisitions tested during the period. The 6 items without an assigned number consisted of 3 desks, a mail sorter, secure area network, and an audio conferencing device. For the second finding related to asset management, related to that finding on asset acquisitions, our recommendations for the office included ensuring the office assigns an asset number to all acquisitions and recording the asset in their system properly, as well as strengthening internal controls related to those measures. Now for the second finding related to asset management. The office did not conduct any physical inventories of its assets during the scope of our audit. The most recent physical inventory for the office was performed, partially completed, which was in February of 2020. Employees told us they had difficulties completing this inventory, partly due to logistics around the COVID-19 pandemic, as well as moving some employees to telecommuting full-time during COVID. Our recommendations related to this were to have the office start conducting and documenting their physical inventories on an annual basis, as well as updating their capital asset system and investigating any discrepancies they identified in that. I can pause if there's any questions, otherwise we can continue on with the IT portion that Mark Matheson will take over on.
Let's go through the,
Whatever you want to do. I just wanted to know.
that's nerd stuff.
I know.
Sorry, that's what we'll get to that when we get to the IT part of it. But if there are questions relative to the first 2 findings, we can do that now, but I would prefer to go through the entire presentation and then we can go back with questions. But Representative Kraft, you are on the list. Unless you really feel the need to go now. Okay, off we go.
All right, with that, I'll turn it over to Mark.
Mr. Chair, committee members, for the record, my name is Mark Matheson, Information Technology Audit Director with the Office of the Legislative Auditor. As noted, I will now provide a brief overview of the information technology or IT security controls that we reviewed during our work at the OSA. Our audit looked at controls within a variety of information security areas. That included the information security program and risk management, inventory of IT hardware and software assets, security awareness training, identity and access management, physical security, security logging and monitoring. And then finally, we reviewed network, data, and communication protections. In general, we found that the OSA did implement some best practices for IT security controls. However, we did identify several areas where the office could strengthen its control environment to better protect those resources. In total, we had 7 IT-related findings. Before we go into the specific details of those findings, again, I'd like to provide a little bit more context of our review. More specifically, as Ms. Lyson mentioned, the OSA as a constitutional office is not required to use Minnesota IT Services or MINIT and participate within their security program. Because of this, they have to hire their own IT staff, implement their own technical infrastructure, and develop that information security program. Prior to us beginning our audit, the OSA was already on a road to make improvements in this area by posting and hiring its first full-time Chief Information Officer, or a CIO. Prior to this, IT oversight was a shared responsibility with other office leadership oversight areas. With only a few IT staff and a couple contractors on site to assist with the work, we anticipated that the IT controls would not be as robust as you would find in a larger enterprise with dedicated resources. For this reason, our methodology takes a look at best practices and tries to implement those controls that you would find in any given organization. And that starts with an information security program. So by looking at the information security program, we can then see how the agency has designed its strategic direction, defined requirements through policies, standards, and procedures, and whether it's assessing its risk on a regular basis, which might include even taking a look at vulnerabilities that exist in the system. This is often done with specialized tools that scan the environment and looks for known vulnerabilities that can then be remediated or patched. However, when we did review the OSA's environment, we did find that they had an ad hoc environment rather than one that really aligned with security best practices. As such, we did make some recommendations for the gaps that we found. We did not find very robust policies and standards that gave clear direction on what security controls should be in place. We found that risk assessments weren't being regularly conducted, and we didn't find a mechanism in place to track known vulnerabilities. So our recommendations were to start with that program and really start with those 3 fundamental areas of implementing policies and standards, conducting more risk assessments, whether they be internal or dedicated penetration tests to see an in-depth perspective, and then finally, utilize some of the best practices for tracking vulnerabilities in systems and applications. The second area that we looked at was within IT hardware and software, also collectively known as IT assets. When protecting your environment, it's really critical to understand what IT assets you have. You have to know what to protect and how those systems interact with the environment. We did make some recommendations to better documentation of IT assets. One element of the inventory of IT assets is to include the support status of the hardware and software. When hardware and software becomes outdated, not only can it have impact and functionality and be something that might break down and not be easily fixed, but also security vendors provide support and details and provide security patches for these products. However, we found that the OSA had a variety of outdated hardware and software that oftentimes was not supported by its vendors. For this one, we recommended that the OSA implement and establish a plan to replace its outdated IT assets. Within the area of identity and access management, these are the controls such as passwords, processes to onboard and offboard staff, looking at a variety of the mechanisms to authenticate its users. While we did find a variety of controls that were put in place by the OSA, we did make some recommendations for the OSA to follow best practices when authenticating its users. Most particularly, we were looking at privileged or people with broad access to the system and having more complex requirements for those authentication mechanisms, more complex passwords. These accounts are often a prime target for individuals because of their broad access, such that they become, with a higher target on those accounts, the added security by more complexity is oftentimes recommended. Finally, we also identified a few other areas within this finding where we suggested that they implement other best practices for authenticating system users. And as Ms. License mentioned, we're not going to go into a lot of details on those specifics. However, the OSA is well aware of it, and we understand they have projects in place to make improvements in that area. On page 36, we reviewed security logging and monitoring. Security logging and monitoring is a process of looking at the events that happen within the computers, the applications, and how those events are logged and tracked. It's a process where there's also to have a regular monitoring process in place so that you can go back and regularly look at these logs. Logs are oftentimes used after the fact when an incident occurs. However, they're also good in being preventative and detecting certain activities that occur within a system. While default logs were often in place, best practices often recommend providing a more comprehensive approach where logs are consolidated into a read-only area, and that those logs can then be retained for future reference and not be overwritten by a lot of extra activity that occurs within the system. So our recommendation was that the OSA look to implement a more comprehensive security logging and monitoring program. Finally, when we looked at the network data and communication protections, we did find a variety of best practices implemented, such as encryption, antivirus, and utilizing network front ends. However, we did identify some areas where best practices were not followed in securing its networks. This included a lack of robust documentation of its network environment that was not maintained and updated. We also, as we noted in some of the IT asset findings, that some network infrastructure wasn't kept current. And we identified that certain intrusion detection mechanisms that were in front weren't necessarily being proactively managed. So as part of our recommendations, we're looking for the OSA to improve its documentation and maintain network documentation, keep things current, and again, put more blocking mechanisms in place to prevent unauthorized network activity. That was a briefing of our audit, and both myself and Lori and Zach are available for any questions.
Okay, thank you very much. Before we jump into questions, I'm just gonna, this is not meant to tear apart the OSA today. This is meant to be a constructive conversation around best practices. It is meant to also say, tell Auditor Blaha, thank you for taking some steps. But I think my colleagues here that have had IT experience would agree that this was a sloppy approach to how do you handle IT inside of a smaller shop. So the findings that are in here, if you were to talk about that for an organization at scale, people would be fired. Their jobs would be immediately eliminated because you didn't take care of some of the basics. OSA is a smaller shop, we get that. But I think that when you look at an auditor who is in turn supposed to go out and audit other organizations and make some of the same assessments that you found inside of your own study, when those things are lacking, it does raise some questions. So I wanted to go through this, wanted to talk through some of those things. Representative Kraft was first on the list. He's looking puzzled. We're just very intent, so we'll let him go first. Representative Kraft.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and appreciate your assessment of my morning face. Maybe just a couple of questions. One, in the financial section, you talked about capital assets that need to be inventoried. Like, what kind of capital assets are we talking about? And then I have one more after that.
Sure. Who's going to handle that? Is that Ms. Lyson, Eiserman, Matheson? You guys want to flip a coin? Okay.
Mr. Chair, Representative, each agency, there are state policies that require agencies to conduct regular inventory of their assets. The Department of Administration has a statewide policy that's every 2 years. OSA has an internal policy that's more stringent, requiring they do an asset log or an inventory of all their assets once a year. Cataloging, making sure the assets are in place, still there, or that they've been removed if the assets have been disposed of. And in this case, OSA's asset threshold, I believe, is any item $1,000 or more.
Representative Kraft?
Yeah, Mr. Chair, and maybe it's a question for that. So you're talking about like computers and office furniture, like that kind of stuff. I'm just like trying to understand capital assets for an organization like that. And I can ask my other question now so we can efficiently, if that's all right?
Well, we're not in a rush for time today, so we can
Okay.
address that question and then get to your next.
You can take that one.
By all means, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair and Representative. So again, capital assets is the word capital is defining of something in particular. So let's just say assets altogether. So the Minnesota Management and Budget has a policy for capital assets. Those are assets that are going to be included in the state's financial statements. Those are typically items that are over $30,000. That's the threshold for those items. Then the Department of Administration has a policy on assets, right? Not capital assets, but just assets like equipment. And their policy has a different threshold where that's over $5,000. And then that policy also allows the agency themselves to have a more conservative policy, which the state auditor does have, a more conservative, where they're going to track anything that's over $1,000. All of these policies also want you to consider sensitive items. Those are items that are easily stolen, right? So laptops, things with sensitive items, like if you have recording devices, phones, things like that. So you have those sensitive items. Then you just have assets, right? Equipment, maybe it's desks, maybe it's furniture. And then you have the capital assets that are bigger, that are over $30,000. So when we did our review, it is inclusive of all of those items.
Okay, thank you.
And just before I go back to you, I think that the rationale there is that everything that the OSA purchases is done so with taxpayer dollars. So having a full account of what has been purchased, just to say, here's what we purchased, we have that list, and we know where they are. It's almost, you came from the corporate world, you'll have a list of assets, and you understand where the depreciation tables are, and you'll understand, when things have met their full useful life. But when items are purchased with tax dollars, I think that elevates the importance of having a comprehensive list to them. So back to you, Representative Kraft.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Appreciate it. I'm just trying to get some clarification. And then in terms of your audit, I took a look at previous audits. Is this the first time you've audited the state auditor on an IT perspective?
Ms. Lyson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair and Representative. Correct. This is the first time we've done an audit of their IT system.
Representative Kraft, anything further? I have Representative Bonner next.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. As you can imagine, I do have a few questions, but I'll try to keep them concise. So we mentioned just a moment ago that this is the first time they've ever had an audit. So in effect, I think we would agree that this is more or less what we would call sort of a baseline, right? So we've established kind of where are we, and then we can work on a plan for going forward in the future. And I wanted to say, one thing that I want folks to take away who are not technical here is, if you haven't noticed already, in the report on page 27, and I think it was alluded to here, but it says, overall, we found IT security controls are typical for a small to medium-sized organization with limited resources dedicated towards IT assets. As a result, certain IT controls were not as robust as those of larger enterprises. Our conclusions for each security area reviewed and our findings and recommendations for improvements were below. So the takeaway I want to just point to everybody here in the room who's not super technical is, my understanding in previous conversations with the auditor herself and so forth is that they are an organization of about 80 people. They perform about 1,000 audits a year. That's their core mission. So they do a good job on that. And for quite some time, I think they had 1 or 2 IT folks. That was it. In the last biennium, they made a recommendation or a request to bring on a CIO, Chief Information Officer, for folks not familiar, to start sort of shoring up this because they saw some gaps. And I know I've talked to the auditor about this before. So I think all of those are really positive steps to shore up those. But then if my memory serves here, we have the staff with, again, 80 people. And I wanted to just check in with the legislative auditor to double check, but I think, or excuse me, our auditor, I believe we brought on a new CIO within the last, but can you tell me a little bit about, I think you may have hired some additional staff around this to try and mitigate some of these findings, and could we speak to that?
Representative Bonner, the state auditor is going to be coming up after this,
Oh.
and she can address some of those questions.
Oh.
I just wanted to keep things on pace for
Okay.
OLA and then OSA, and then we can
Okay.
talk about the confusion that having 2 auditors in the room at the same time brings for our committee.
All right. Well, that said, I would just say, maybe I'll change my line of questioning then for you, because some of my questions were probably for the auditor and the CIO. But one of the recommendations, so I agree that, some of these are excellent suggestions, right? Like, we should have good security protocols, and I know they did note in the report in 2024 that they did start doing sort of training for employees to get on top of that, make sure that they're following the right protocols. There's some really good cyber hygiene recommendations in here that are pretty good. I think they're good. One of the things I was going to ask, though, in specific, because I think this is probably more related to your findings, and Mr. Mattson, perhaps you can speak to this, but one of the recommendations was, for example, around penetration testing and some of those more deeper dive items. Now, this is a pretty small agency, and I think you probably know where I'm going with this. Is it typical to have someone on staff who can address those kinds of needs in a small agency such as this?
Mr. Matheson.
Mr. Chair, Representative, in general, penetration testing is oftentimes done at where there's much higher value data, more robust resources. It is oftentimes recommended, though, to take a look at and do some sort of vulnerability assessment that doesn't go to the in-depth penetration, trying to actually break controls that do exist. We mentioned the level of controls in which the best practices dictate. Many of these many of what we recommended are at that, they have a grouping of 3 implementation groups in best practice. Those that you find at every organization, those with a a medium-sized organization and those that are more enterprise-focused. We focused on about the 150 different controls that are designed for level 1, which has 57 controls, and then level 2, which has another 75. Penetration testing isn't necessarily within those first 2. However, a regular risk assessment that's maybe done internally would be something that would fall within levels 1 and 2.
And before I go back to you, Representative Bonner, I will say that you don't necessarily have to hire on staff someone to do pen testing. There are a myriad of vendors, or penetration testing, sorry, nerd speak. You don't have to have that person on staff. There are a great many companies that can be hired to do an annual penetration test, provide a report, provide steps on remediation, and then you just say thank you for your service. You cut them a check for their one-time service, and off they go. So back to you, Representative Bonner.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I guess that's actually kind of where I was headed, is that that isn't necessarily something you would typically find in a smaller organization. But yes, there are certainly pathways to do that. And I would say that, while I appreciate that they've brought on a CIO. I appreciate that they are developing a plan, and we'll probably hear from them more in a minute on what that looks like. But just kind of level setting for folks here that isn't something typical that you would have on hand, right? That's a level of expertise that's sort of above and beyond, and that you would probably need to bring someone in to do that. So thank you for that. And I think that is, I will leave it there for right now, and I have some more questions when we get to the auditor.
I will also say, Representative Bonner, that given the level of some of the stuff that the OSA does have, like they house the state single audit, where there is a fair amount of very important data, that even though they are a smaller shop, not having basic cyber hygiene things in place, knowing that they have those things under management and storage, that they should be, and they are on the pathway towards that. But I think it's important to note that given the level of sensitivity of some of the things that they have under their control, that they should have been doing these things. But Representative Howard, you're next.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. My question was about finding number 5, that the hardware and software is outdated. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about not just kind of what that looks like from your findings, but presumably those kinds of updates are things that require investment. What kinds of what can you tell about the sort of those pieces, and particularly if you have expertise or advice about the level of investment it would be required to sort of bring those things up to where you feel they should be?
Mr. Mathen, go ahead.
Mr. Chair, Representative, as we looked at the IT asset inventory, I think we identified 45 different servers, network devices, printers that were over 10 years old, and a handful of those were over 20 years old. As a small office, you do have to balance the costs of replacement and recognizing that smaller organizations oftentimes try to get more useful life out of their investments. Many times you can find IT assets that still work and they still function and provide a good business value. However, when the vendors no longer provide the support for that device, it does put it into a critical nature, and oftentimes there's a term called technical debt that comes with something to that association. And recognizing having good information, as we mentioned in the details of providing that, having a more robust inventory of your IT assets and where they exist and whether they're supported or not, oftentimes then can provide more value to agency leaders in recognizing that we have to build up a plan to start replacing this and moving that forward. So as part of that risk assessment analysis and recognizing that we might have IT assets that are no longer supported, that can then start that process for understanding what are going to be those costs to replace and move those forward. As we mentioned in the report, we did identify, and OSA was actively working on replacing a good number of those outdated assets by the time that our audit had started. And most of the high-level critical ones were already corrected by the time and replaced by the time our report was released.
Representative Howard, anything further?
Yeah, just a quick comment. In some ways, when we see a finding like this, I think we need to recognize that it sounds a little bit like an us problem. We're at the legislature have a role to invest in our state government entities to make sure they're meeting the needs of the public. And things like adequate, up-to-date IT, that costs investment. And, if we want to get the best service and the best efficient deal and work for our constituents, that requires our partnership, our buy-in. And when our state agencies are asking for resources to make these kind of updates, we need to recognize our role in it.
Representative Howard, I will say that over the last number of years, when you all were in the majority, you spent record amounts of money, and this was still a deficiency. I just wanted to jump in with a question as a corollary to that, to, I guess, Mr. Matheson. One of the findings was that the OSA had not been using standard practices like strong passwords or two-factor authentication. And I had heard from some people that, well, their gear was just too old to facilitate that, which is not the case. But if you could speak to that point, I would really appreciate it.
Mr. Chair, in recognizing that some technology, as far as being outdated, does require advanced authentication mechanisms, the stuff that we had seen could definitely support the hardware that we had seen in the software was capable of providing some of the controls that we were suggesting. Additional resources for, you mentioned advanced authentication. There are other tools that could be put in place, but there are solutions that are somewhat cost-effective that do provide the same objectives.
And again, to that, and then I'll move on to the next on the list. But so something as simple as a strong password or a passphrase, as is often used in the IT industry, is something that when the software that is being utilized is updated, comes along with that. So if you're using a modern license for the software that you use internally, that is enabled within that next rollout. So a strong password or a passphrase. Passphrase, again, sorry, we're going nerdy here. Representative Bonner is liking it, though. So passphrase is effectively something that is unique to you, that is perhaps 18, 20 characters long, and it could be something that is unique to you, and I'll pick on Representative Kraft. Your passphrase could be, I like to make ice cream 2025 exclamation point. That is not something that from a password attack tool that would be very easy to understand and be able to compromise. And then the regular and mechanical changes of saying now you have to change your passphrase after a 30-day period of time. That's what the findings were, that was not being done. The two-factor authentication is also a sense of tokenization, and that's something that you know and then something that you have. So you use your password, but then you can also use a one-time log-on key or some other things that you do to make that much more secure. The goal here, and I'm sure our auditors in front of us and Representative Bonner would agree, is to shrink the footprint that is out there for attack. And doing something as simple as, and this is what I do when I'm out speaking, this is, log off of your computer, use a complex password, use two-factor authentication, and that's what was not happening, and that's what we found in these findings. And Mr. Matheson, is that a correct assessment?
Mr. Chair, yes, those are valid assessments.
Okay, thank you so much. Representative Jones.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I just have a process question. So I was noticing at the end of the report, the response from the OSA was saying when they expected a date of resolution. Will you do kind of a follow-up after the end of that resolution? Can you speak more to what that looks like?
Ms. Lyson, you want to handle that one?
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair and representatives. Yes, we will do a follow-up. That is not something the Financial Audit Division had been doing previously, but actually currently right now, we just started the review of prior audit findings and will continue to do so. We obviously have to look at when that will be implemented and won't actually follow up until we know that they're going to have that implemented. So typically 1 to 2 years after, depending on what the finding is.
Next on the list is Representative Cleaborn.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I'm not exactly sure who of the testifiers would like to answer this, but when I was looking at the National Institute Standards and Technology and the CIS best practices, I looked to see how many of those controls and safeguards there are. And I see that your findings are actually quite small. Can you tell me the total number of controls and safeguards you actually looked at?
Mr. Matheson?
Mr. Chair, Representative, right offhand, I don't have the exact number of controls. When we scoped the audit, as I mentioned, we focused with the primary scope. You mentioned the Center for Internet Security. That was one of the primaries. So within Group 1, there's 57 controls, and we assessed most likely roughly right around 50 of those. And then in Group 2, there's another 70-plus controls, and I'd say we looked at probably 25 of those.
Representative Cleaborn.
Well, the reason I asked the question is because, when you put out a report like this, right? So there are actually, I'm really impressed that there are so few findings in reality. But it's good in a report to let people know how many things you looked at, right? So there's some idea of the validity, if you will, of what's in place and what's not in place, right? So when you make a broad sweeping statement like internet security, I'll just go to passwords and penetration, right? Okay, so if you are saying, and I'm just making these numbers up so as to not give away any security, right? If you're saying that, okay, there was inadequate password protection because they maybe would use 12 characters instead of 16, whatever the best practices might be. Well, the message that they had lax security sends the idea that, whoa, they were woefully deficient, when in fact, it might have been very insignificant, but still not up to, quote, best practices, right? The other thing that causes me great pause about the report is you yourself are saying, do you need to have a conversation?
No.
I'll pause. I'm
Please
happy to do
proceed,
that.
Representative Cleaborn.
You yourself are saying that when the time you started this report, a chief information officer had not yet been hired or was in the process of being hired. So we are putting this report out today saying all of these things are bad when in fact good things are happening, right? So I would have preferred, this is just me, I would have preferred that you had said, okay, all of these things are happening. There was no rush to put out the report. Let's take a pause, give them time to do the work that they are doing and we see that they are doing, so that the cities, townships, municipalities would have confidence in the idea that these good things are happening, right? Because they hook their systems up to this system.
Well, Representative Cleaborn, I think Auditor Randall would like to address
I didn't ask Auditor Randall for a
Well, I
question. I
did.
was just making a statement.
So I think she would like to, Auditor Randall, would you like to respond to that?
Yeah, I don't know if that works. Thank you, Mr. Chair and Representative Cleaborn for the comments. I appreciate them. I do want to direct folks' attention to the beginning of the report, starting on page 11, where we walk through the methodology and it walks through the different items we tested. So that does give the broad overview of the different controls we tested. And also as to the timing, we are working really hard to do each constitutional office on a 4-year rotation. That's something that we used to do a long time ago. We kind of fell off, and so now we're getting back on that rotation so that we kind of give each administration a good look. And so this is part of that rotation. So regarding kind of the update question as well, we will be back here 4 years later for sure, and looking to see what has been implemented. We are always evaluating programs and offices in midair, right? It's like building the plane in midair. I mean, programs don't stop when we conduct an audit, and so we go in, we look at things as they are, and then make recommendations for improvement. And my understanding from having conversations with the state auditor, and I'm sure she'll come up and she can talk for herself, is that she found this to be a really helpful roadmap because, and she has said it was good timing because they just hired a CIO, and now we've come in and said, hey, here are some areas to really focus on.
And
Mr. Chair.
I'll comment. It's important that when we have the OLA has come up with findings, and I don't think that you were leading towards this, but if the encouragement was to not publish this at all because things were.
That's not what I was saying.
Representative Cleburne, we'll talk through the chair. I always gave you that same courtesy when you were chair.
No, you did not. I did not cut you off when you were talking to testifiers. I did not do that.
Nonetheless, I think that publishing these so that they can, the OLA can show that they've done this work is also their ability to prove that they have been doing work and the people in the state of Minnesota can find comfort in the fact that they are watching all the things that we are doing. Representative Cleburne, do you have follow-up or?
Yes, I was in the middle of a statement when you cut me off, and we could have avoided some of this.
Representative Cleburne, please proceed.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So my question to the panel, if you will, was, so you've issued this report, and while you were doing your audit, which I totally appreciate, and I appreciate the 4-year timescale, or the 4-year scheduling, when you see that things are actually in progress, the very things that you're going to now tell the public are deficient, would it not make sense to give them time to do that so that the public has an actual representation of the work that is happening, right? So to come in and say that these things are all deficient while they're in the very process of putting them in place doesn't hit my fairness gene. I think that's the problem, right? And it doesn't give the public an actual view of what's happening in the big picture, right? So if you're talking about 171 standards and controls, and you find that they're deficient in 2 or 3, that's a different picture, right? Than just coming in and saying controls and best practices are not in place based on these standards. That sounds very much more deficient. When you come in and say asset management systems are not in good place, we found 3 desks, an audio conferencing. I mean, 3 desks out of how many? Out of how many pieces of equipment, capital equipment do they have, right? I mean, it makes it sound like they're just not tracking their things, where also in this period of time, we're moving, we're asking them to go to 2 different locations. Lots of different pieces are happening, right? So I just want to make sure that in these reports that we're doing, and I validate the fact, this is what you came in, this is what you saw, right? Get that. But at the same time, what it doesn't tell the public is the bigger, broader picture of what is actually happening. So that's why I say it would have been better, in my estimation, to have paused the publishing and say, we came out, we looked at this, we saw good things were happening, and then we went back. So this report is maybe delayed a little bit due to going back. And yes, we can establish they did these good things. And I find it incredibly rich, Mr. Chair, that you are saying that the auditor's work is sloppy and that things were missing.
Representative Cleburne, I did not say her work is sloppy. I said her practices internal to IT practices, of which I know way more than you do, were sloppy. And when she was in my office, she did not discount the fact that they were deficiencies. She did not discount the fact that they were not something that were best practices, but she did point out, and I agreed, that she was remediating them. So Auditor Randall, would you like to respond to the?
Excuse me, Mr. Chair, my statement to you was this: I find it rich that you're calling these practices sloppy.
Because they are.
and you voted against the Chief Information Officer.
Auditor Randall.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Representative Cleavorn, for your comments. I think my first response is the Office of the Legislative Auditor, and particularly through these performance audits, what we are doing is looking at internal controls, right? And the idea is to identify problems, even if they're small, as soon as we see them, so they don't become big. And so if an inventory asset system is in place that misses a few things, right? It's not, the sky isn't falling, but it's important to note those so that the entity can correct them before it becomes a lot of things, before it's not just a couple of desks, but it's also, IT infrastructure and computers and et cetera. And so it's all about prevention and identifying those smaller little holes before they become big holes. And Ms. Lyson has some comments to add, but I can't decipher her handwriting, so I'm going to let her do that. If that's okay, Mr.
Ms. Lyson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair and Representative. Just speaking to a couple of things. So I understand the acknowledgement of wanting to show what the state auditor has done. Unfortunately, we just don't have the resources to go back in that moment and hold off on releasing that report, which is why we do have the response letter from the office so that they can provide any information that they want of the progress that they're making. So that is a forum for them to provide that information. And then just to kind of expand on what Ms. Randall was saying, for instance, with the inventory in particular, so we're looking at the acquisitions that happened during our audit scope. That's not necessarily all the assets that are there, right? The capital assets, the sensitive items that we talked about before. It's the acquisitions. So if we're seeing that 60 of 70 some in our time frame wasn't being recorded, what does that look like as a whole, right? Is there other years that they weren't recording something? It might be a desk this year, and it might be the security area network, but what was it, 2 years ago, or 4 years ago, or 6 years ago? So as Ms. Randall is saying, we're just trying to call attention to an internal control weakness. So it might not seem like a big deal to you with, 6 items missing that are only like a desk, but it could be a bigger kind of picture item for the office. So we're just calling attention to that.
Representative Cleavorn, last comment, then I'm going to try to get to the rest and then give the
that's fine.
OSA time to respond to this by around 9:20, so
I can totally appreciate that.
Thank you.
And I want to make sure that I'm perfectly clear. Had I not been interrupted when I was originally making my statement, we
Cleavorn,
could
let's
have denied,
continue.
we could have gone on without all of this explanation and back and forth. What I'm saying is that when we do these reports, and I appreciate the work that you do, and I do appreciate the statement that you made. Yeah, it's 3 desks today, it could be something larger later, right? Totally get that. And the auditor, as the chair has mentioned earlier, has been very receptive to the report and is 100% interested in making sure that best practices are followed. So this isn't really about the auditor or about the work that either auditor's office, right? It's about the fact that we want to make sure that we're giving Minnesotans the clearest and best picture that we can, right? That's my statement. So when we do these reports, it's important that the timeline is in place, there's no statement in here, I didn't find it, that investments in these systems had been made sense by the legislature so that these things could be brought up, right? So between the time that you did your audit and the time that the report was issued, it says nothing about that they now have the resources to do some of the work that you are looking at. So the report gives, yes, a picture, a snapshot this moment from COVID, but it doesn't give the complete picture of what the office now has the ability to do or is working on. That's all I'm saying. Thank you.
we're going to go to Representative Joy.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. First of all, I'm going to make a quick comment. We talk about this transparency. It seems like that we want to bury into the black book, and we don't want to be transparent to the people in the private. But what I am seeing is, I will give a shout out to the lottery office, as there was a report done on them, and I was talking about it in this committee, and they met with me, and they gave me a spreadsheet that showed me the dates they were going to complete these things and hopefully take all the recommendations, get done. So kudos to what you guys did. You're getting them there through. Now, I'm going to put my private sector hat on, being in the convenience store industry for 28 years, and we talk about small agencies having 80 employees to do this. I had to upgrade my pumps for $275,000 to be in compliant for PCI compliant. Anybody who don't understand that, that's protecting cardholders' information. On a monthly basis, we have to walk our pumps and look at these tags if they're cut, and we have to report that. We have a third-party software that scans quarterly that costs me about $22,000 a year to check for outside IP addresses, to check for anything. I don't hire somebody to do that. I cannot. I worked for another company, it cost us $1 million a year to have our stores scanned. So when we talk about small agencies, this is the government. Us private sectors would hope the government is being held accountable. And when something is done like this, when they scanned my store the first time and I saw what happened, we got our checks and balances. We didn't have 1 to 2 years to get done. When I didn't get my pumps done right away because the delay what took place with getting equipment and everything, I was fined $600 a month per pump for 4 pumps until I came in compliance. That wasn't a choice I got. I was trying to get in compliance, but the equipment wasn't there. You know, we have inventory in our stores too. That is our job to make sure they're checks and balance. It's interesting to me that us sit here as legislators in this job and we want to come down on reports. Why did it come out in the public? Why is this? You know what? When we have a breach at a convenience store, it's in the public. We have insurance to protect this and we have to pay that premium. You know, so I give you guys 100% credit for what you do because you know what? Everybody's having to do things like this and we should be setting the model here. And when they come out with a report, it would be pretty easy, I think, like the lottery did, to sit down with a 2-page report saying, you know what? We are going to complete these recommendations or we do not agree with these recommendations and we can work on that. But you know, to sit here and lecture that we're taking these and we're putting these reports early, this is not right. Minnesota expects transparency, and I hope we can do better. Thank you.
We're going to go to Representative Quam, and then we'll go to Representative Freiberg. Representative Quam.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And first, to the auditor, you can do it with a nod. I just heard that the last group, there are 4 legislative groups that submit their names, has been just submitted so that we can actually start the LAC again. Thank you, because I've missed that legislative interaction because that part wasn't done.
Just for those watching, Auditor Randall nodded because we're all about transparency.
Yeah. But a lot of people don't realize we see this audit or that audit. I've been on the LAC for long enough to see repetitive after, 4, 5, 6 years, the audits. And the most disappointing thing are when the same suggestions or gaps are seen. Now, there are some entities that have, and it's always noted during the hearings, that they have taken care of 5 of the 6 or whatever, what progress they've done. Because we do want that known that they're helping. But an audit is just in that time frame. And if you wait till this thing is completed or that, you would never have an audit completed, which means you never would have that feedback of what to work on. Someone said, well, they had moves and stuff. Frankly, if you're moving, you better be taking an inventory of all the items to make sure you didn't forget anything or something got lost. So having moves involved recently makes it a bigger red flag that not all the inventory is known, located, those type of things. So it's analyzed. But the letter and response allows for, between the time the audit's done and the writing of the report, they get to see the report before anyone else, and they do the response to be able to let us know what they have been able to do. And so I think fairness is present. But my concern, especially with all the discussion about IT, is we don't have the bandwidth in all entities to be able to continually monitor things that pop up that the public doesn't know. You see, I need a new update on my phone, and they'll make a little bit of notes. When you're talking about business IT, that is not out there in the public, we're going to fix this problem. That there's a different way. You subscribe to support service or et cetera, but you've got to have people that know how to take that knowledge and quickly implement it. And that's why there's some people have a concern on the smaller ones, if they're not using Minute, that they are utilizing the resources that can help them quickly address. Because we've seen in multiple audits of where there have been bad actors, and they seem to try something, and once they see they get away with it, they will try it in multiple departments. And we've had that come up in the audits. So if you've got, concerns and want the rest of the story, you can have an appointment with the auditors, and they can come in and bring it in and specifically address your questions. But having things blacked out, that's for the good of everybody, because we don't want the bad actors taking advantage of that information. And if anyone on the committee has any questions about, the audits, I can give you some independent feedback on the process. But utilizing this, everybody gets better when somebody outside looks and says, what about this, this, and this? So thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Representative Quam. And we've got Representative Freiberg, Representative Bonner, and then I'm going to try to get to the OSA by 25, maybe 30, if we can be judicious in the use of our time. I just want the OSA to have time to come up and share her comments. So Representative Freiberg.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I have two questions that I think will be fairly quick. First, just for the OLA specifically, I know you guys do policy reviews, financial reviews. I'm not sure how many IT reviews I've seen, but what is your staff level of expertise and capacity when it comes to IT? I know it's a very specialized field, so if you're.
Auditor Randall.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Representative Freiberg. I'm going to let Mr. Matheson talk about the specialized
Mr. Matheson.
expertise.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Representative, we have a very small team. There's 6 of us that go out and perform IT audits. Due to increased funding a couple years ago, we were able to move from 2 to 6. And so that brought us up so that now we've been able to get out and do more of these reviews. And one of, as we mentioned, the constitutional offices that aren't supported by Minute, those are some of the areas we're now able to get into. As far as our expertise, we are certified information security auditors, so that's a credential that our team has. Myself, I'm a CPA as well, a certified public accountant, and a certified information systems security professional. So again, I think as we look to enhance our skills, we look to have a diverse set of skills, people with network experience, some folks with security, some that specialize in project management, some that specialize in just compliance, in understanding the vast array of requirements that come from security.
And just before I get back to you, Representative Freiberg, CISA and CISSP are not exactly handed out. It takes a lot of effort to get to those. How many CISSPs do you have on staff?
Just myself.
Okay, very good. Representative Freiberg.
Thank you. My second question is, so I know when you're doing financial audits, there are pretty well-documented standards you follow, GASB standards and so forth. Looks like for this audit, this IT audit, you referenced industry best practices. I heard a couple acronyms referenced as to what those would be, what those are. But I mean, I know IT is a field that changes very rapidly and advances very rapidly. Like how, best practices seems like a pretty potentially subjective term. How would you respond to that, especially when you're comparing it to some of the standards you use for your financial audits?
Mr. Matheson, if you would.
Mr. Chair, Representative, yes, inside information security, there is a handful of different best practices that are defined. In our scope and methodology section, we footnote and reference the National Institute of Standards and Technology. NIST is one of those, and that's widely accepted by the federal government, and it's used by a lot of organizations. It's a base model for which Minute builds its information security program. There's the Center for Internet Security. They provide a wide array of best practices. We often will look, in performing an audit, one of the things we want to do is go against management's expectations. So the policies and standards and audit against those. And then compare that to what best practices might have. It was mentioned that the payment card industry, or PCI, they have a lot of best practices recommendations for implementing. Depending on the types of data within state government, there's the IRS has specific requirements for protecting the security of federal tax information. It's called IRS Publication 1075. So there's a wide array of different components. In healthcare, when we look at healthcare systems, we're utilizing requirements put forth by the HIPAA organization and CMS. And so there's a wide array of these, and having a security program in place helps align what your controls are to some of these best practices. So oftentimes that's what we auditors really like to see is, whatever best practice your organization has chosen to follow, how well are you aligning to that then?
And Mr. Matheson, I'll also ask you a question before we move on to Representative Bonner. As a CISSP, best practices are continually updated and you are always made aware of those, and those are things that you integrate into the practices that you bring to bear as you do your next audit. Is that correct?
Mr. Chair, that is correct. Keeping up on this is a full-time job. And again, in an organization with limited security dedication, it becomes very challenging for those small organizations without the dedicated resources.
And the reason I ask that is because I'm not sure I heard it per se, but that there was a comment that perhaps you yourself were not as up to date in the studies that you were doing, and that is not the case. You're as a security professional, you are always updating what is the best practice, as any good auditor or any good security person does. When something new comes out, you make sure that you study it, make sure that you're up to date on it, and that when you do a critical evaluation, you are using what is the most updated. Representative Bonner.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So I kind of just want us all to take a deep breath and reground us a little bit for a minute. I think what I want to say is that, page 27 made pretty clear, right? This is a baseline audit. The findings here, to be upfront with you, I don't think any of us, particularly those of us with a background in IT, are really shocked. This is a government agency. They're relatively small. They don't have a lot of dedicated resources in the IT area. They've recently just hired a CIO to identify those gaps and start making those remediations. So I think that's nothing shocking here. To the point about the report, and I'm just going to throw this out here, because Mr. Matheson, I actually have great faith in your skills. But what I want to say is that in many organizations, one of the things when we create a baseline audit is that generally we have a period where we go back and we take a look at what the remediation plans are, what's maybe been remediated, and how we do that. And I realize that you're tight on resources, but I'm just going to put this out there, that from a public perspective, from a perspective of someone in IT, I don't find that this report is as useful as it could be without the next step, without having that piece. So what my recommendation would be is if we're going to continue to do these audits going forward, and I'm going to be very blunt, we will very likely see some of the same patterns emerging in every organization you go to. We're government. We don't generate, and many of these departments don't generate revenue, so they don't have the money to pay for the upgrades. They have to come to folks like us in order to get the funds to do that. So I guess my suggestion to you would be, when you're doing these types of audits, that it might be useful to talk about what would be a reasonable time period to go back, and then follow up and write in your report whether or not there's a remediation plan in place. What does that look like? How many of the items that were identified have already been remediated? I think that would be a much more useful and helpful thing to have going forward than just saying, here's what we found, and then nothing. And I think it's also awkward that we're having this conversation in which we're talking about the findings, but we're not actually hearing from the auditor. You know, we have the letter, but that doesn't really get to the detail of what we were gonna ask. And so I will say part of the reason I didn't ask a lot more questions, in all honesty, is because I'm not surprised by the findings. I'm more interested, in all honesty, in what is the remediation plan. I'm more interested in what are the short-term things that you're doing to fix it? What are the long-term things? And specifically, if you have things on that list where, because you're not generating a lot of revenue, and those things are gonna require time, money, and effort, I'm more interested in hearing from our new CIO, what do those plans look like? And what do you have in place? And how can we, as the legislature, help you? Because more than likely, those are gonna require money. And so I will just leave it there, but I just want to say that I really do think that if we're going to continue doing these, that would be perhaps a more helpful approach. And it would probably stave off a lot of the questions to you and that defensiveness, because I think you're doing a great job. You should absolutely be doing these audits. Having a baseline audit is a terrific idea. The CIO and I think the OSA have already acknowledged that this was great timing for them, because it gives them a roadmap, right, on making those remediations. So I thank you for your time. I thank you for your expertise. But I just would suggest that those might be updates that you may want to consider, so that we can avoid some of this in the future, because I don't think it's fun for you to be on the hot seat and being criticized. But I also think we could do this reporting in a more efficient and effective way to provide more value. Thank you.
Auditor Randall, closing.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Representative Bonner, for that. I appreciate the comments, and honestly, I always appreciate the feedback, because what we want to do is be useful. I might just suggest that I feel like the audit did what it was intended to do, because it highlighted all those questions for you that you want to follow up with OSA for. So I'm happy to get out of here and let Auditor Blaha sit here and answer those questions. But I feel like it, ideally it helps in, well, you have such deep knowledge in this area, but for others too, to identify where they want to ask those questions. So, but thank you, and I'm happy to work with anybody and how we can make our reports useful. Thanks.
Very good. We will then ask Auditor Blaha to make her way with her entourage to the testifier table. Auditor Blaha, welcome to the committee. Before we start, I'll just preface it by talking about a conversation that you and I had when I called you to talk about this report. And I will say that you agreed that this was something that was not a best practice, and that you were grateful for the opportunity to come and talk about it, and that remediation is underway, but that you were taking the criticism at face value. So I will just say I appreciate that, and I appreciated the conversation that we had that night. So if you would, introduce yourself for the record and proceed.
Thank you, Chair Nash and members of the committee. My name is Julie Blaha. I'm your state auditor. Luckily, Julie Blaha and Judy Randall have a lot of things separate, so it's easy to keep us separate. I'm joined here today with our operations director, Matt Lindeman, and with our new chief information officer, who is not only our new chief information officer, Kathy Frazier, but is also her first time testifying. What a wonderful way to start.
Well, we'll have to make sure we give her a warm welcome.
I'd like to start again, Chair Nance. At the entrance meeting for this audit, that's where we found out that for the first time we were going to also be assessed on a set of best practices. These are ones we're not necessarily required to do. We didn't prepare formally on them. We are not, we didn't choose them. Now, of course, the knee-jerk reaction would be to cry foul, call them fair, gotcha, or political theater. But we're not doing that because this is really timely. This is exactly what we needed at exactly the right time. And this assessment, again, used as a baseline and understood for what it is, extremely helpful. And I do also want to mention to some of the concerns people have with audits, more in general, because I think the concerns, particularly that Representative Cleavorn and Representative Bonner bring up, are about the structure of how an audit works. I mean, our audits look like this too, right? They are snapshots in time. We give people a chance to respond, but that's all they are. And so if nothing else, the issue is not, I don't think, in how the report is structured. It's on what we do with it. It's on us to keep that context in mind and on us to do it well. Because again, as you have conversations about how can we explain that snapshot idea better, that's something that it would be interesting to us as well. Though, again, a lot of these choices are standardized. This was not a review, this was an audit. So there are a lot of things that we all do them exactly the same, right? They're standardized. So some of these things are just a function of how an audit is structured too. Now, I can say, those of you on the committee 2 years ago may remember we came to you to fund a chief information officer and additional IT staff. Now, we came to you even though we never had a data breach or a significant loss of data. The closest thing would have been in 2006 where we had 4 laptops stolen. And that caused a big change in people's activity. And since then, we have been able to stay ahead of it. However, the way we're able to stay ahead of it is if we are continually looking and continually improving. And of course, our data risk is not as high as other agencies. However, we all know that the environment is changing rapidly, and you do not need to have social security numbers or credit card data to be a target anymore. So we want to dig our well before we're thirsty. We don't want to wait until we start having problems. We want to get ahead of it. And so again, that funding was a huge, huge help. And as a result, to implement these resolutions to these findings, we will not need additional funding because this funding with the additional staff is put us in a good place. Of course, but when we come back to talk our budget, we will have opportunities for you to support technology. So the way this kind of went, we saw a potential risk to our office, we staffed up, we started taking action, and then our audit came in, and they came in and shared this with us. So it's like, okay, we're gonna lean into this. Everybody, let's be real clear, let's be real open, and let's dig in, let's figure this out. Let's find out what we know. And so we not only did we get a good set of information for us specifically, but I think there are some larger things you can learn from this audit about general trends really across the country in audits right now. There were probably 4 trends in our findings that I want to call out. The first one is staffing. From the first 2 findings, a couple of the other ones, staffing turnover has been one of the most common things we see in people's reasons for why they have a finding. Almost in the audits that we do, the audits of the boards I'm on, the audits I hear about from my colleagues in other states, one of the most common things you'll see is the word vacancy, retirement, turnover. Those are very common issues. Now, that doesn't mean that it's not important. What it means is we all need to look at that, and probably more globally. We're not going to stop and just say, oh, hey, we fixed the issue we had with the inventory and the turnover we'd had in there, and tightening up the training there. But it's something we should look at our whole organization, and all of us should. We are going to have staff that have less experience, that are going to have maybe different qualifications than we normally have. So we're all going to have to beef up the guardrails around supporting new staff and about making sure things are kind of automated. We're not going to be able to rely on experience in the same way. So I think that's something not just for our inventory system, but really all of us across the board. In addition, the idea of documentation and planning, you'll see that some of these findings have to do with, we were not necessarily documenting toward being audited on something like this. Again, the audit first heard of it when it started. However, these are all good things to do. Sure, we haven't had the level of robust documentation when you don't have a lot of issues coming in. They stick in your brain. You think, I not need a database. But again, we got to dig our well before we're thirsty. We're not going to wait until we have trends that we need to analyze to have a way to analyze trends. So that was particularly a really helpful thing. Also, this helps us, these standards are good standards. These are good best practices. So this, again, was really timely as we're building our plan, to be able to say, okay, these are the standards we're going to aim toward. They're worth aiming toward. These are the right ones. And hopefully everyone who's hearing this, who may have not had an audit like this, knows, hey, download these 2 standards. Maybe we all commit to these, that these are the ones we're going to focus on there. And I think the third, and one of the big things that has been alluded to already, penny pinching is a big trend in this data. You know, we take being frugal with taxpayer dollars very seriously. Just this morning, yes, I grabbed my toner and I shook it a few times to see if I could get a few more prints out of it. Literally, I did do that, but it didn't work. And we get every drop out of our stuff. We drive it till the wheels fall off, right? And yes, though, this finding is a really important message for us, and I think all of us, because yes, we need to be frugal, but not to the point of a false economy. Of course. You know, if the risks are outpacing the savings, we've got to update sooner. That's just all there is to it. That usually shows up and we incorporate that into our operating adjustment asks. Keeping up with technology, we try to put in our operating adjustment. So that's why operating adjustments are so valuable, because we want to put those in there. And again, at this point, we don't need funding for this because of the last session. But we will, that's where you'll normally see it. So again, this review was very helpful. I think if we all handle it right, use it in the right context, understand what it says and what it doesn't, ideally we'd have people lining up for these reviews. People saying, oh, I want this, I need this, dig in, I need you to come in, let's get ahead of it. That's the kind of environment we want to create to be successful. So again, I'll tell you, as auditors, every single finding drives us nuts. You could just see, it's like, even if it is not something that is a huge risk, it is still something we hate. And we believe we are on track to get these all of these findings resolved this year. And we look forward to next year coming back and showing how much progress we've made. So with that, we'd be happy to take questions.
I'll ask a couple questions of Ms. Fraser if she'd like to lean into the microphone a little bit. Ms. Fraser, welcome to state government and welcome to the committee. As it relates to the findings of the OLA report, what's that? Okay. Relative to the findings of the OLA report, you have remediation underway on those things. If you could maybe detail some of the things that you've been doing, particularly around strong passwords, two-factor authentication, a pen test or penetration test, full system scan, things like that, if you would. And introduce yourself for the record, if you would.
Mr. Chairman, Representative, thanks for your question. Again, I'm Kathy Fraser. To answer your questions about the projects that we have in place, at this time, we are in the process of implementing two-factor authentication. That should be completed in the next few months. Additionally, what was the other questions?
Oh, any other plans? Yeah.
Strong passwords, two-factor authentication, vulnerability scan, pen test, full system scan, so on.
Yes. So in addition, last fall, we invested in managed detection response, endpoint detection response, software to better manage threats and vulnerability and assessment. So that's in us. This year, we are planning to hire a contractor to do some pen testing for us.
Okay. We'll go to some member questions, and then if we have time, we're going to move a couple of vehicle bills out. Representative Joy.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Looking at the back of this report that we were just talking about, there's a response from you on January 27, 2025, to some questions in here. Did that come from your office, and was that responding to the letter that was sent out on January 29th, or was it just because of dialogue why that report came out? Because the findings came out on January 29th, the report of theirs, and your response was the 27th. Was it because of the findings, or were you requested that report?
Auditor Blaha.
Thank you. Thank you, Chair Nash. Thank you, Representative Joy. That's, again, this is a way audits generally work, right? When we get our exit meeting, which was, was that December? Was it? I think it was December. Yes, so this audit started in January of last year. The field testing was done primarily in the summer, and then they worked up the report. We had our exit meeting in December, and that's when they shared all those things with us. And then we also get to then do a response. So the response, we hear what the findings are, then we get to respond. And then, and I believe the 27th is an accurate date for when that response was current to. And then that is included in an audit. And you'll see this in financial audits as well. We'll tell you, the risks that we assessed, and then you get to respond and say, we're doing this, we're not doing this, we agree with this, we don't agree with this. And that's a typical part of it. And so we finish it on that date, but it's part of the entire release, and that's why the date will be a little earlier.
Representative Joy.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And so when I see a report like this, this is what we like. This is what we like for transparency in the report. And I hope continuing as you complete these dates, you can update this report as when this completion is going to be, because obviously responding with a report like this costs you nothing. You're able to do it. And that's where, we don't have to always worry about funding. We just have to make sure that we're being back and forth playing the tennis game and making sure we respond and hold people accountable to these dates. And if we don't meet these dates, leave the date in there and say, now our new completion date is this for X, Y, and Z. So,
Auditor Blaha.
Thank you. Thank you, Chair Nash. Thank you, Representative Joy. In fact, and you just explained exactly how findings on an audit work. Findings don't go away on an audit until they're resolved. And so that's one of the powers of an audit, is that you're going to come back at every audit. You've got to give evidence from the previous findings. They're retested, even if things have changed or you're looking at other things. So yes, we are accountable to these findings until they're gone. And again, because we believe these are reasonable standards, that makes sense. One of the challenges I think is going to be, though, on any sort of best practices for IT is in the time period, again, a 4-year time period. By the time we get to the next time period, I would guess that some of our resolutions to current findings would then become findings in the future because they would be out of date. So I think one of the opportunities with a best practice kind of a review with an understanding that these are rapidly changing standards is so that we can be very current, very nimble, but that context may be important because, again, we change our passwords and say, great, you had them, and now they are not long enough. So we could both resolve a finding and have another finding just in that time period. So I think we have to kind of get our hands around that. But yes, every audit has that response in the back, and again, it keeps coming up until it's like my math class. Yeah, that homework isn't done. It's going to keep coming back until it's done.
So Auditor Blaha, as a quick corollary, would it be safe to say, based on what you just told us, that you don't find that this report being published was unnecessary, premature, or that this was actually a valuable thing to actually have published, even though things were underway? Would that be correct?
Chair Nash, of course, if it started out with a wonderful glowing review of the fact that we fixed it all. I mean, again, this is, but the comments that are coming up are, again, I'm solid with this, again, because I have a chance to speak to it. But it does get at, though, common misunderstandings about audits. If we put something in an audit, getting that calibration of how big of a risk is this? How much should I be concerned about this? How mad should I be? What level it is? That is a really difficult thing for us to communicate. And I think the message, though I am happy with this report, this is well-timed, I do take, again, just to us as auditors as well, how do we continually make it so that someone who doesn't read audits all day long knows what they're reading? They are really hard to read. And do we have the best language in there we don't want anyone to underreact. You underreact to a finding and you get a problem. You overreact to the finding and you overspend on a solution. So either way, we don't want either. And so I am really taking to heart the idea of how hard it is to get a sense of how bad is this in an audit. And those are fair things to challenge Jets on.
Okay, I'd still like to move some of these vehicle bills out, but we have Representative Kraft and then Representative Bonner. If we are able to wrap up, rules is coming in here at 10. So Representative Kraft.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I just have a reasonably brief comment. So I really appreciate this session today. I've learned a lot. I do want to say that, Mr. Chair, that you started off this session by saying the auditor wasn't, but we weren't here to aim for the auditor. I forget exactly what the words were. But then you did proceed to say sloppy practices and would cause people to be fired in other organizations. And I think that put us on a adversarial path that wasn't necessary. As I look at what's happened, just factually from what I hear today, we have a small agency. The financial audit was solid. First-time IT audit. It appears that you had already identified this as an issue and we're trying to get ahead of it. 9 findings total, 3 are already done. The rest are to be completed this year. It seems to me that you are modeling the kind of response we want from an agency to an audit. And so like that's what I'm taking from this. As we hear of audits in other agencies, it seems like you are modeling that you're out there trying to get it done. You've responded, you've embraced it. And so I think that's factually what I'm seeing is that's what I'm hearing today. And we had a lot of back and forth, but I thank you, and I thank the OLA for the work on this. It seems like it's doing exactly what we would want it to do.
Representative Bonner.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm going to save some of my comments because I think maybe it's better addressed in a one-on-one conversation in a deeper dive on, the specifics of your remediation plan, and that I'd love to go over that with you. And, that's geeky, nerdy me that I'm not sure the whole committee really needs to get into. But, I don't think these findings were surprising. I think we're going to see that a lot more in a lot more audits. I've already made my comments about how I think that could be done a little bit more efficiently because to our point, it's hard to have context in these reports and to have more information that's helpful for legislators. We often don't get that. But I know as a new CIO, I say, first of all, welcome. I'm sorry, this is your introduction, right? And I understand that you've already been hard at work, putting in mitigation plans and assessing your level of risk. I assume that you already have a prioritized list and that you've already broken those down into short-term and long-term remediations and what that looks like. So again, love to have that conversation with you. I also want to say I'm heartened by the fact that you have started doing an annual security training for your employees. Often your employees are the weakest link, so I appreciate that you've started that path. I also appreciate that you've started contracting out to get penetration testing, that you've had some conversation about sorry, I can't even read my own chicken scratch here, that you're trying to up your maturity within the organization and address things like cybersecurity, your hardware and software concerns, and I assume you're in the midst of an assessment to determine how you could phase out that approach, particularly with equipment. And just to be clear, like even in my household, we have this old freezer. It's noisy, it's loud, it's inefficient. We hate it. It probably sucks too much electricity. But as my husband would say, it still works, right? So while it's not great and it's not the latest and greatest, when you have tight budgets, sometimes you do what you got to do. So I get that. So I just want to be clear about that. And I guess my question then would be specifically to some of the questions around the hardware and the software and that phased-in approach. And do you, by chance, already have sort of a plan for how to phase that in? Do you have some estimates on what that might cost? And what does that look like? Because I know one of the things that we've been talking about with the Governor's Technical Advisory Council, Representative Nash is on that, and the Legislative Commission on Cybersecurity is how we secure reliable, stable funding for IT resources, but also for modernization. And, in Minute, we actually created in the last couple of years a modernization fund to help smaller agencies be able to put in for projects where they can make these improvements. But being separate, you don't have access to that kind of a fund. Mm-hmm. So that means we have to have a little more planning. So I'm just curious if you could tell me a little bit more about, whether you've put together sort of a phased approach. Is that in process? Do we have any estimates around what that might cost or, those kinds of things? Or where are we in that process? Maybe you're not that far yet.
Ms. Frazier, and then we are going to try to get to the vehicle bills. Representative Bonner, is that the last of your questions before?
Yeah, maybe just a follow-up comment, but that's it.
Okay, Ms. Frazier, if you could briefly.
Mr. Chair, Representative, thank you for your question. So I started 10 months ago, and in my first 6 months with the agency, my focus was on staffing to build up the capacity that we needed to move forward with our IT infrastructure. So we hired 2 additional staff within 6 months of my joining the organization. At that time, I also developed a strategic plan that includes 3-year priorities for the organization. In the first year, our focus is around tightening our security, and that's been a big focus for us. So these findings aligned very well with some of the things that we already had planned. So those are the focus that we're going to do. Additionally, part of assessing your security risks is also making sure that you're phasing out old technology, infrastructure, and so forth. So we've identified those priority items that we need to replace this year, in year 1. And that planning has been started on that. So we will be phasing out about 7 servers as a result of that work this year. Long-term is to, this year, develop a technology roadmap because for the next remaining 2 years, we have a lot of infrastructure, and we don't have the staffing to support the type of infrastructure we have. So looking at how can we best utilize software as a service, cloud services, to transition some of those things to reduce the support that we have to do from an administrative perspective. We cannot hire security experts to keep up with the growing security threats that we have. So we have to invest in technology to do that.
Representative Bonner, very briefly. We're going to try to get to the 2 vehicle bills.
Thank you. And I that was exactly on par with what I was hoping to hear, so thank you for that. I really appreciate that we're on a pathway, that we're putting together that roadmap and all of those pieces. One thing I would also like to suggest, and I know we talked about the cloud, I believe the OLA has actually contracted with Minute for some of their cloud services and sort of is acting through them in order to leverage that. I would say, Minute, you might find that a useful pathway as well as you think about moving things into the cloud and so forth. I know that's a big passion of Chair Nash's. And there may be other ways in which you might be able to lean on their expertise, even though you do not have a direct relationship with them. And I would encourage you, as you find additional needs, or whether that's funding, whether that's replacement of equipment, software, all of those things, or if it's maybe seeking out additional help from folks who are on the TAC or other folks that might be able to help make those connections to build that infrastructure as you go through your plan, that would be really great. Thanks so much for being here today.
Thank you, Representative Bonner. So we're going to move to, thank you very much. We will make sure that we.
Can I give one sentence?
Sure.
Chair Nash, I just want to thank you. You know, one of the things I was hoping would happen today is we could model how you use a baseline well, how we encourage people to look at it. And I have to say, the level of respect and context people were seeking here was extremely helpful. This is how we hope it works. Thank you.
Very good. Auditor Blaha, we will get you back on the calendar to talk about your budget requests. And then we will briefly move to Representative Cleavorn.
I just wanted to say thank you for the work that you do, and welcome Ms. Frazier to, and I appreciate the work that you're bringing to the office and the professionalism that you're bringing to the office. And I also want to say that I appreciate the way that you work closely with Auditor Randall to make sure that everything is in sync and that you're doing a good job. Representative Kraft took my closing comments, so I will say thank you very much and look forward to hearing your budget request, and be honest about the needs that you have in your request. Thank you.
Thank you.
Very good. So we're going to move on to, I'm just going to drive from here in the sake of expediency. So we have 2 vehicle bills. Representative Cleaver and I have talked about these. The need for vehicle bills is a handy thing so that we can have bills that we can amend things into. We're going to try to leave some here in the possession of the committee. We're going to have some in Ways and Means. We'll have some on the general register. So we have two House files here today, House File 1060 and 1062. So I am going to move before us House File 1060 and refer it to the committee. Actually, we're going to move it to the general register. This is at its heart a repealer, and Ms. Urick is here. In consultation with the LCC, there have been identified some things that no longer have a shelf life here. This in particular is to remove the Legislative Commission on Minnesota Sports Facilities. It's not been meeting. It hasn't met in a fair amount of time. So I'm going to move House File 1060. And Representative Cleaver, you have a comment?
I would just encourage my side to vote yes.
All right. Any comments? Once, twice, gone. All in favor? Aye. Opposed? Okay, House File 1060 has been referred to the general register. I will now move before us House File 1062 and make a motion to send it to the general register. Same scenario, different area. This is for to repeal the Driver and Vehicle Service Oversight Committee. For those of us that were here, we should want to get rid of this thing because it was a dark time to be a legislator when we were dealing with MNLARs and other things. Chair Koznick is shaking his head like a bobbleheaded doll because it was a bad deal. Representative Cleavorn.
I just want to make sure that this bill is only used for state government as a vehicle bill, and that's it. And if that's the purpose and the intent, then I would ask my side to vote yes.
That is correct. This is a vehicle bill for state government. Any other questions? I will then renew my motion that House File 1062 be referred to the general register. All in favor? Aye. Opposed? That is moved to the general register. Members, we are 1 minute early, so we are adjourned.